Hello everyone, and welcome back to the D&H Solutions Lab. With you once again, my name is Matt Allison, Cloud Technical Specialist, and this is an awesome day for me because I get to show off Windows Virtual Desktop. This is a product that has been asked about for years now, and conceptually longer than that, and it is finally here. It is available today in public preview, and my hope is, after we've done discussing what the product is, how it compares to, its competitors, we're going to go through an entire demo of how you set up the whole host pool from beginning to end and even connect to it using our LG all-in-one thin client. So my hope is by the end of this video, you can hop right on to the Azure Portal and you can begin this process yourself. Keep in mind, this is not a simple and short, this is a fairly simple, but it's definitely not a short deployment. You're going to want to pencil out at least 2 hours in order to get this done. Depending on the configuration, it could take longer. That's the idea. This is a lengthy deployment. So let's get started and we'll talk about everything that you need to know in order to do that today. So the first thing is, let's just get out of the way what in the world Windows Virtual Desktop is, or WVD, and how it compares to its competitors. So first of all, a little bit of background. WVD is the culmination of many, many years of a desire from the industry, which is to simply host a Windows desktop experience or environment remotely. Originally, of course, on on-prem servers. Today, we're talking about a service that is running in Azure in the cloud. Traditionally, that was complicated. That was difficult for customers to accomplish, mostly due to licensing restrictions. In order to actually accomplish the sort of remote desktop experience, you would need to deploy remote desktop services, which was technically an application that runs on top of Windows Server. So not only was it typically an expensive production, in other words, you would need at least one pretty beefy server where you had segmented into multiple virtual machines, each running separate roles, and each of those roles needed to work together. Depending on the number of concurrent users, you potentially would have had to add additional servers in order to be able to host all of those users at the same time. So this experience is what we're all kind of used to today. And as I mentioned, it was typically pretty complicated. It normally would require, at least initially when RDS was first deployed, at bare minimum 4 separate virtual machines or separate servers running separate roles. These roles included like web access, a web gateway, a role called a connection broker, and then finally, the crux of it all, a session host. You sometimes would need multiple session hosts depending on the number of users that you had connected. Same with those other roles. So if you're unfamiliar with an RDS farm, if you're unfamiliar with an RDS deployment, that description I think should give you at least a basic idea of the complexity. It usually required a large capital investment too when you considered that hardware. Today we're talking about WVD, which essentially takes the technology that has been used for many years behind RDS and combines it, containerizes it, packages it all up into a single service that is simply running on the Azure platform. Specifically, it takes all of the logistics, all of the connections and therein, all of the authentication, all of the stuff that isn't necessarily unique to the customer, and puts it in a nice little package. And then all you need to worry about, all you as in the host of this environment needs to worry about, are the individual session hosts. These are the VMs that are running the actual applications that have access to all the data that your customer needs to access. And so that way, it makes management of it extremely easy. It is multi-tenanted, which means that you can host multiple customers from the same service. All you need to do is containerize or to group together separate VMs that are containing those separate session hosts. And it is licensed extremely easily. It's all you need for a Windows Virtual Desktop environment is a Windows 10 license. So that can be acquired simply through a Windows 10 Enterprise license via CSP, or you can go what we really would recommend is Microsoft 365. That gives you the Windows 10 Enterprise license, excuse me, as well as Office and as well as Enterprise Mobility and Security, which is a fantastic security suite. If you want to know more about Microsoft 365, absolutely check out my previous video on it. It is really worth your time. Once you have that license, Then the only other payment involved in this is the actual usage, the actual utilization of those virtual machines that you're using in Azure. So it's really, really simple. And on top of all of that, this service is an excellent companion for the Innovate Up campaign that we talked about earlier this year. If you weren't already aware, in January of 2020, the end of support is coming for Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7. So if you have customers out there that just downright refuse to leave Windows 7, I know that they exist, this is an option for you. So there has always been the option to spend an awful lot of money to get an extension of that support for up to 2 or I believe 3 years following that general end of support. Most of the time, you're not going to want to do that. It's better to invest that money in newer, better systems. But if you, again, have a customer, let's say that has a line of business application that just won't work on Windows 10, you have the option of migrating those desktop systems to Windows Virtual Desktop, and you are given the extension on the end of support for up to 2 years for free. So there's a lot of benefit to this program. There's a lot of incentive for you to wrap your heads around it. But let me just, we're about to get into the demo, but let me talk about some of the prerequisites that you definitely need to be aware of, and also just some of the stuff I think you should know. I mean, the number one thing to keep in mind, that what we're talking about here is it's a pilot. This is still in what Microsoft calls public preview, or beta, essentially. So by the end of this video, I would love for you to hop on to Azure.com and try this out yourself. But keep in mind that this is not necessarily for production. We would not recommend this for production today, but later this year, we are anticipating a general availability. There are a handful of connections. For example, you at this time cannot use Wvd in connection with exclusively Azure AD. You must have an on-prem or virtualized, what have you, domain controller with a traditional Active Directory domain services running on it in order to use this service today. I'm being told, though, when it goes to general availability, that won't be the case. So there'll be a lot of things like that. This is to get your head wrapped around it before it launches later this year. Okay, so let's get into some of the prerequisites. These are some of the things that you should know before you try to launch this off yourself. First of all, you're going to need an Azure subscription. That seems pretty obvious, but let's just make sure that that's clear. For that, of course, we recommend reaching out to our cloud team so you can sign up for a CSP account. But if you already have one, or if you'd like to demo this, you can always just go to Azure.com and sign up for free, and you get $200 just to play with for that first month. So I recommend checking that out. You're going to want to download and install the Windows Virtual Desktop Commandlets for Powershell. We are actually going to use Powershell a handful of times during this installation, and you're going to need that module installed and those commandlets available to you in order to do that. Make sure that your virtual network, so you're going to need to create a virtual network in Azure prior to any of this. So it needs to be in its own resource group. It's actually kind of a best practice that we've been talking about a lot in-house here, where you want to make sure that you put most of your virtual machines in their own resource group. It kind of segments everything, makes it nice and clean as far as your different environments are concerned. But for this installation, it's an absolute must. You must have it. Same goes for your, you must have a domain controller, as I mentioned, and that domain controller must be running ADDS. Now, for our demonstration today, since we don't actually have an on-prem system, I have already created a virtual machine, which is running Windows Server 2016, and it has been promoted to the domain controller on our network. But of course, you can use an on-prem server for this exact same situation here. And then you're going to want to use Azure Active Directory Connect to synchronize that on-prem directory with your Azure Active Directory. Now, if any of this is like, you're just like, what? We do have additional videos that can help you with that process. So we've created a video already that creates a domain controller in the cloud and promotes that domain controller. And then another one for syncing your directories using Azure AD Connect. So check those out if you need to have further information. Additionally, single sign-on is kind of funky right now as far as this current build. I haven't been able to get SSO to work properly. I do believe that has something to do with the current restrictions with Active Directory, so we're just not going to use that. Keep that in mind. And finally, you're going to want to make sure that all of these new resources, everything that we're about to create in Azure, is in its own separate resource group. So you're going to want to create a resource group before we get into the actual meat and potatoes here, so that you have a place to put all of the resources we're about to create. Okay, with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, next step. Now that you have all of your prerequisites taken care of, you got your Azure Active Directory and everything's signed up and ready to go, now we need to provide consent to the Wvd service to gain access to your Azure Active Directory client. So for that, you're going to bring up a browser and navigate to rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com. This is the Wvd consent page. And as you can see, we have a server app and a client app, and you need to provide consent to both. So it's fairly straightforward. All we need to acquire is our Azure Active Directory tenant GUID. And you can find that right back here in your Azure Active Directory. So I'm already here, but on the left-hand side, if you click on Azure Active Directory, brings up the current directory that you are in. Make sure, of course, that this is the correct directory. And then select Properties on the left-hand side, and right here you'll see Directory ID. And click this button here to copy, and paste that right in here, and click Submit. So once you've done that, then you simply want to sign in with the administrative account that has admin privileges over that particular directory. For me, that's this account here, adminmatt@dhdemos.onmicrosoft.com. Go ahead and enter my password. And click Accept. There you go. So now that's how we do the server end. We need to give it about 30 seconds to a minute for it to run through all its cycles before we do the client side. But for that, we're going to go right back to that same website. So I usually just delete all of this up here because we're going right back to rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com. Select Client App, and like I said, give this a good 30 seconds, and once that is done, click Submit again. It'll ask you to sign in. Once again, I'm going to sign in with the admin matt@dhdemos.onmicrosoft.com. It doesn't ask me for my password since I'm already signed in. And then ultimately, we just click Accept to accept those permissions. And there you have it. So that is step number one. That is how we get out of the gate and get our Wvd service recognizing this particular Azure Active Directory account. Step number two is we need to now jump into the Azure Portal. Now we need to create and assign the tenant creator role to a particular user account in this Active Directory so that they have access over this Wvd service. So I'm back here at the Azure Resource Manager. I'm going to go ahead and select Azure Active Directory again on the left-hand side. Under Manage, you'll find Enterprise Applications right here. Go ahead and select it. And then right out of the gate, you should see Windows Virtual Desktop listed here. If you do not, you can just go up here and search for it. It should come up. First try, I've seen it each time, but I understand that it may not be there, so I wanted to point that out. Once you have it listed here, you want to select the first one. And you're going to go ahead and go to Users and Groups, and we're going to add a user. Now, I did this previously to the same tenant, but we're going to do a different deployment this time. So I already have admin Matt in here as a tenant creator, but the way you would is just click on Add User, select the user. My directory has very, very, very few users, so I would select admin Matt, and then, select. And then you see it only has one role available that I can add as an assignment, tenant creator, and then click Assign. And then you'll see tenant creator here as role assigned. Okay, steps 1 and 2 are done. We have created the relationship, the consent between our Azure Active Directory and the Wvd service. We have then from there created a user who has the tenant creator role. Now we actually need to create the Wvd tenant. So for that, we go into the world of PowerShell. Okay, so first thing we want to do is just some house cleaning here. I wrote down everything that we need to do at the top in our script here because it's really, really simple stuff. If you have any familiarity with PowerShell, you should kind of fly through this. But let me show you where I got some of this information. First of all, this broker URL, this is the URL you're going to use in order to create this connection no matter what. So this never changes. That's rdbroker.wvd.microsoft.com. Whereas our Azure Active Directory tenant ID and our subscription ID are, of course, going to be unique each time that we do this. So that's why I like to use variables. That way you can change out these two properties in the future if you want to just save this as a script. So where do we find these? So first we need the Azure Active Directory tenant ID. That one should be pretty self-explanatory since we have already done that. That is back here again, the Azure Active Directory, and then under Properties, right here, Directory ID, you click Copy, and you paste that right in here. Subscription ID is then found under Subscriptions, which I usually save out here. If you don't see subscriptions out there, you got to click on All Services, and then you'll find subscriptions usually pretty close to the top under General, and then right here if you want to pop it on the left-hand side here. I only have the single subscription, but you're going to want to select whichever subscription you are using to make this deployment, for example, CSP. And then on the left-hand side, click on Properties, just like we did with the directory. You're going to copy this subscription ID at the top, and then paste that right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and just get these preliminary commands started. So I'm going to highlight that, click here. And it's going to ask me to sign in. And this is going to be the Azure Active Directory sign-in information. So I'm going to use my admin Matt at dhdemos.onmicrosoft.com account. So when you're doing this yourself, keep in mind this initial consent is for authorization for Azure Active Directory. So you want to sign in as the Azure AD admin. Once you have done that, then we want to create a new Rds tenant. So for this case, I've already created an Rds tenant named dhdemos. I'm going to go ahead and make another one called dhdemos2, but I'm of course going to use the same tenant ID and subscription ID that I used before. So that command, new Rds tenant, and then these variables. Let's go ahead and run that. That quick. As you can see, it gave it a default tenant group name. And then recognize the IDs for both the subscription and the tenant, and then finally the tenant name. This information is great. I always like to keep this command handy as well. This, if you ever forget what your tenant group names are, you can always click get, or type in rather, get RDS tenant, and you can get this information. As you can see, here's the previous tenant that I created. Okay, then finally I have these two other scripts here. I want to at least bring this to your attention. Obviously, start AD sync cycle is an important one to know whenever you're using Azure Active Directory. You'll learn more about this in my Azure Active Directory video. And then finally, this other one, which is add RDS app group user. This is important for adding additional users to these particular tenant groups. So this is when you are ready to put your ad department in this, and they are going to connect to a particular tenant group. You would list them out here, or you would create a script for each one. Again, we're not going to do that for the demo. For today's demo, we're just going to use the existing users that are already in Active Directory and my admin account, which we have connected to our tenant. Okay, so now that we have those first few steps complete, we have created an actual tenant group, and we're ready to go. Now is the time where we finally get to deploy our very first Windows Virtual Desktop host pool. So in order to do that, we're going to bring up Azure Resource Manager again, and we're going to click on Create a Resource, and we're going to type up here Windows Virtual Desktop. It'll be usually the first one that's listed here. Just like anything else in the Azure Marketplace, you can find that by browsing down through it, but typing in Windows Virtual Desktop is much easier. Okay, once you have it here, then we're going to click Create, and we'll get started. Now, the first step is your basics. So clearly this is this is pretty straightforward. Host pool name is the name of this collection of VMs that will host this particular experience. In other words, you might have some customers who want an entire full desktop solution or experience. So this could be called full desktop. And then you might have other customers who you might give remote access to, like an individual application that's containerized within this service, which is definitely something else that you can do. You might have some that have a certain line of business application or whatever. This is where you make that distinction as far as the group is concerned. For our purposes, for our demo, I'm just going to name this generically Wvd demo host pool. And we can move on. Next is desktop type. Now, desktop type can be pooled or personal. This is a pretty important step that you should just at least know what we're talking about. So pooled, basically what that means is it takes all the resources that you provision for this service and pools them together. And then when each user connects to this service, they are given essentially a slice of that pie. Whereas personal would be you have an individual VM for each individual user that you have connecting. Obviously, each have their own advantages and disadvantages. I'm sure you can figure that out for yourself. If you have a VM for each user that's connecting, that's an awful lot of resources that are tied up for this. It may be required for some solutions, so make sure that you're aware that that is a thing that can be done, but expect it to be rather expensive, depending on the number of users. Okay, next we have default desktop users. These are going to be our Azure AD users that actually can connect to this service. I'm going to go ahead and add admin Matt at dhdemos.onmicrosoft.com. And I'm also going to add user1 at dhdemos.onmicrosoft.com. Just in case I want to show you connecting with the user. Really, my plan is to add just to connect with the admin account. But either way, we're going to add, this is where you would add as many users as you like, separated by commas. These can be added later as well. Okay, next we have subscription, self-explanatory. This is how you're paying for this service, followed by resource group. Biggest gotcha here is to keep in mind that you need to use a brand new empty resource group for this deployment. So all the resources that this template, this engine that we're about to start running here is going to generate, they all need to go into a blank resource group. So we're going to click on Create New, and Wvd demo will work just fine, And then finally, location. As far as what it is, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's the location of the data center. The only thing to keep in mind here is this is important for whichever location you select, all available resources to this group. So if you would like to add additional data or whatever the case later on, they all need to be located in the same data center. It's currently one of the few restrictions. So please just to make sure that you take note of which data center you're selecting at this step. So I'm just going to stick with the East US 2. That's usually my go-to. All right, next we have, this is essentially configuring the session hosts, the actual virtual machines that are going to run our desktop experience. What I really like about this, what do you call it, template, I guess, that Microsoft developed for this deployment, is this step here is really more of a tool than anything else. By selecting your usage profile, light, medium, heavy, or custom, and then the total number of users, it actually generates a suggested virtual machine size that includes quantity and size. So as you can see, for 100 users right now, it's suggesting 4 standard D8S V3 virtual machines. And each of those, as you can see, have 8 vCPUs and 32 gig of RAM. This is a bit much for what we're trying to do today. I'm just going to drop that down to 10 users, and as you can see, it automatically drops this down to just a single VM, with the same specs. That's fine for what we're doing today, so I'm just going to move on from there. Finally on this step is virtual name prefix. This is merely just part of your naming convention for each of these session host VMs. So for this one VM that we're going to have, it's not as nearly as important, but if you have several VMs, what you would do here is add something like, I'm going to put WVD DH, here, I'll put it all lowercase. I like to put RDSH to indicate this is a remote desktop session host. So for each virtual machine, let's say I had a dozen, they would each be numbered with this part first. It'll say WVD DH-RDSH-01, 02, and so on. Next, and this is usually the big gotcha pane right here, so be sure that you're filling in this information correctly. Okay, so this is actually configuring the VM to connect to your directory. So, excuse me, the very first step doesn't have exactly a lot to do with that, but I guess it could. This is the image source. This is where the image for this particular session is going to come from. Now, we're going to stick with Gallery. Gallery is, of course, your generic, just base OS. In this particular case, I would just like to bring to your attention this is a multi-session version of Windows 10 Enterprise. This is a new version of Windows 10 that was developed, exclusively for Wvd. We can also change this to Windows Server. I imagine this will expand as they expand the licensing restrictions, but for now we have Windows 10 and Windows Server as our options for these multi-session, multi-user VMs. But you can use blob storage or a managed image portal to submit your own VHD to use as a template, to use as an image for each one of these systems. So keep that in mind as well. For what we're doing today, though, we're going to stick with the generic image. Moving forward, disk type. Self-explanatory what this means, HDD versus SSD, but the only thing I want you to keep in mind is in the previous step when we were selecting our VMs, in fact, I'll just step back here and show you, you can actually manually change which VM you'd like by clicking here, change size. One thing I want you to note, though, you can change to any size you think that would fit as far as the number of CPUs, the number of RAM, and so on, but keep this in mind, premium disk support. Some of these VMs, especially some of the older ones, do not support premium disks, which another word for that is SSD, at least in the world of Azure. So when you are selecting, if you plan on selecting an SSD, please make sure that you just take note of this column. What's interesting is it will not notify you at all during this setup that you have selected a VM and a disk that won't work in that particular VM. So in other words, you will go through the entire process, you will try to deploy this, and you will receive an error pretty early on in that process, and that will have to do with the disk. Okay, so here we are back. I'm going to stick with SSD because I know mine is compatible, and I want to connect here. So for this is going to be my on-prem admin account. So be sure you are using the correct directory for each of these. So for that, that's simply dhadmin@dhdemo.com. I'm going to put in the password. Now this is optional, but I do recommend selecting specify a domain. I've had trouble with these deployments in the past when I don't do this. I can't exactly give you an explanation. I just wanted to share with you my own experience. It has worked better for me by actually manually entering the domain in here. Now, if I add an OU, you could also add that OU path here as well. I don't, so we're not. Finally, your virtual network. As I mentioned at the top of this video, you will need your virtual network to be located outside of this resource group. So it's a good idea to just simply create one that you might use for multiple other VMs and resource groups and label it VNet, whatever the case. Multiple subnets are also important, especially if you're running multiple environments. I only have the single subnet. Again, this is a demo environment, but this is where you would select your subnet. Once everything is done, click OK. And then we'll move on to authenticating to the actual Windows Virtual Desktop Service. So this is part of what we just set up prior to this step. Back here in PowerShell, we can see here we have our tenant group name, our ID, and our tenant name. And when you look here, it's asking for your tenant group name, which fortunately is the default. Right here, tenant name is going to be dhdemos2. Oops. And then finally, your UPN for the account that you selected as the tenant creator role when we were in the directory. So for me, that was, again, admin Matt at dhdemos.onmicrosoft.com. And then your password. Okay, and that is it. So that's all the steps as far as the configuration for this deployment. This step here is going to validate those settings just to make sure, as you can see, validation passed. I usually take, just a recommendation, I usually take a screenshot right here. This is everything that we just did, the entire summary, so it's just good to keep that in your notes. But once you're done with that, you click OK. It'll load this information, and then we will hit Create to create this host pool. Okay, there you have it. So with those steps, we have now officially deployed our Wvd host pool. And now the only step left is to show you how we connect to it. So there are a couple different options. First of all, it's not a traditional remote desktop connection. So you can't use the traditional RDP client that's included in most copies of Windows. There is the latest version of Remote Desktop, essentially, is what it is. If you go to aka.ms/wvd/clients/Windows, so that URL gets you immediately to the download for the latest RDP client. And the biggest difference is instead of connecting directly to a connection packet, like you have an RDP file, which includes all the connection information, you actually connect to the service, the Wvd service that we've been discussing. You sign in using your Active Directory information, and it actually displays for you all of the available sessions all the available remote sessions that user has. So that's what makes this ultra convenient for multi-users on a single device especially. So let's go ahead and actually show what that connection looks like, what the actual experience looks like. For that, we're going to return to our LG Thin client. So this is a all-in-one monitor-style thin client. It's a 24-inch display and with all the components on the back. Very thin, so it's relatively cheap. It comes with Windows 10 IoT, which is also a very, very scaled-down version of Windows. Gets you the connectivity that is necessary for a thin client, and ultimately that's what we're looking for. Okay, so to connect to this service, you're going to want to actually connect to aka.ms/wvd web. That is the URL that brings you to this sign-in page. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in actually with user 1, hdhdemos.onmicrosoft.com, instead of the admin, merely just to show you, that we can still access it with that user account as well. And like I said, once you sign in, it's going to discover what sessions are available to you. As you can see, I have DH Demos and DH Demos 2. Those were the two different tenant groups that we created. If we had multiple VMs, you'd see multiple sessions. And then in order to connect to them, it's just as simple as selecting the session you'd like to connect to. Hit allow. And there you go. So we have now connected to the service. Now it's going to ask me to sign in again. This is merely because we have not set up single sign-on, and the way that we would do that would require to confirm DNS records in order to maintain a domain name. So I didn't actually do any of that because, well, that's just extra steps that aren't involved with this actual setup. But for most of your solutions, that sort of thing is already going to be done for you. So just keep in mind that you usually won't have to sign in a second time, especially once you have set up a complete directory. So there you have it. This is the remote desktop session. Now there's a couple of files here. I made a text document as well as a folder just to show you that it is perpetual. This is information that I created actually before the weekend, and it stayed there the entire time, and it will as long as the VMs remain running. Now, to add to all of this, that's an important thing to keep in mind. The perpetual nature of this isn't locked into the directory or the service itself. Like I said, if you keep it up and running, it will stay perpetual. All the changes that individual makes will stay on that particular session. Every time that user logs in, it will remain. However, if you have multiple VMs, you could potentially lose that session because the session could jump from VM to VM. And so ultimately, to overcome that, the last thing that we need to talk about is an application, or a service rather I should call, by Microsoft called FS Logics. Now this is a whole other conversation, something else that we may have to address here later on with a much more shorter video so that you can get your head wrapped around it. But essentially it is what saves individual user profiles so that they're able to log on every single time to the exact same experience that they left off. So it takes sort of a suite of these efforts to really put a remote perpetual desktop in front of your users each and every time. But that's really what was the point of this video. Remember, this is still in beta. We're still talking about a public preview service that's going to have bugs. It's going to have little gotchas that hopefully I was able to mention a couple. There were a few that we had to even edit out here. So I'm anxious to discuss this. I'm anxious to discuss this with you in our live Q&A that's going to follow just here in just a moment. But in general, please be sure to email the Cloud Solutions team at cloudsolutions@dnh.com, myself at mallison@dnh.com, and stick around if you have any specific questions, and we can continue this dialogue. But until next time, have a great one.